Welcome to the Microsoft on AWS Learner Series, where you'll watch a series of videos focused on optimizing Microsoft workloads in AWS. This is a 6-part series focusing on a single customer's journey in the AWS cloud. Each video in this series focuses on a specific workload and demonstrates how our customer optimized each workload. Let's meet our customer. Acme Financial Data Services, or AFDS, is our fictional customer whose workloads we will be focusing on throughout the series. In phase 1 of their AWS journey, AFDS chose to lift and shift their environment into AWS and completed this phase of migration. The vast majority of their infrastructure now runs on AWS, running primarily on EC2 instances running Windows Server. So what now? With the migration complete, AFDS wants to focus their attention on optimization. This means fine-tuning existing workloads and maximizing the benefits while running in the cloud. Throughout this video series, we will see how their overall architecture transforms and demo the steps AFDS took to make their changes. By watching AFDS's journey, we hope that it gives you the insight and knowledge to help optimize your Microsoft workloads. Here are the videos in this 6-part series, individually broken up to cover different areas of interest. We will start with part 1, learning how AFDS was able to optimize their licensing costs.
Good day, my name is Julius Sacramento, a Solutions Architect in AWS, and welcome to part 1 of Microsoft on AWS Optimization series. And part 1 will be focusing on optimizing infrastructure and licensing costs with AWS. So let's get started. In this initial section, we will mainly be looking at some of the programs and tools that are available that help inventory and assess your existing assets and licenses, then track and efficiently manage them to prevent runaway costs. As you can see, it's a pretty straightforward architecture that you can typically find in large enterprise environments. The end goal is to properly right-size these assets by looking at and analyzing the utilization and resource consumption data that can be captured using the aforementioned tools that we'll be focusing on. Since the focus of this particular session is around assets and licenses, we will be looking at some of the specific tools that can help ADFS optimize and manage your licenses. In this case, Microsoft-specific licenses that is required to run their workload in AWS, as described by the architecture. We will look at the Optimization and Licensing Assessment, or OLA program, a program that helps the customer, or in this case ADFS, to get an accurate inventory of their assets, which include resource utilization metrics that are important in properly analyzing and right-sizing as they migrate over to AWS. We will also look at AWS License Manager, an AWS service that takes the heavy lifting out of managing these licenses and gives you the flexibility and control to manage your license usage to match your organizational structure and processes. Let's take a look at the Optimization and Licensing Assessment Program, or OLA for short. If you look at the top 3 boxes, those are typically the challenges that the customer face in general as they migrate over to a cloud infrastructure or AWS. And the 3 bottom boxes describe how the OLA program can actually help them. The OLA program, in a nutshell, empowers customers to make data-driven migration decisions by providing right-sized and licensing optimized outputs that show your customer how they can optimally run in AWS. This data-driven output includes opportunities for reserved instances, spot instances, optimized CPUs, dedicated hosts, and in this case, Microsoft BYOL, or bring your own license options. It's essentially hard to win a race if you don't know where the starting line is, so OLA helps you find your baseline. It lets you understand your current costs, whether it's on-prem or even in the cloud. And it lets you understand what those costs would be when lifted and shifted towards the cloud. In the case of ADFS, this gave them the capability to properly capture their utilization data across their fleet of servers, then help them understand and develop patterns and right-size their assets and licenses, which is essentially the starting line, the foundation, or the blueprint. Now let's take a look at the first component of the OLA program, which is the data collection. Now this basically depends on a couple of different requirements from the customers. First is the timeline. So with data collection, it can range from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. It can also work with the customer's existing data. So the longer the time frame at which your data collection can run, the more accurate the assessment can be. This is basically because it actually captures the usage, the peaks and valleys of your specific workloads or workloads. So it can either be an agent-based or an agentless collection mechanism. So this really also depends on your security posture of your IT. So if your IT can actually allow for agents to be installed, it then can actually be able to capture detailed utilization metrics from the operating system and even from the application itself. This allows it to also be able to capture the different dependencies from an application standpoint, whether it's connecting to this particular database or another application. With ADFS, they had a 4-week time frame for their assessment phase. They were able to use an agent-based collection mechanism, which was within what was allowed by their security posture, which then allowed them to capture detailed resource consumption metrics, which included storage I/O, which is especially useful in properly mapping and right-sizing their application and total SQL Server footprint. Once the data collection is complete, the customer is then given access to the curated data, usually via their online portal. The collected data can then be shared with AWS, who can then validate the proper mapping of the assets to the correct EC2 instance types. Should there be any correction or newly discovered assets or even workloads, those could then be manually tagged and added to the inventory, then reassessed. Again, the most important part of the entire process is the accurate data collection and presentation across a given time frame, which allows for accurate right sizing, which is a significant factor when reducing cost. With ADFS as infrastructure, they were given a cost-effective scenario that utilizes dedicated hosts to house a good chunk of their application servers. With their Type N edition of Windows Server, which is Data Center Edition, they were able to license at the physical core level, which netted them a 2-to-1 licensing ratio, hence effectively halving their licensing cost for those instances running inside those dedicated hosts. Now, for their awareness, SQL Server Enterprise Editions, which they also have, could also be licensed within those dedicated hosts at the physical core level, giving it the same 2-to-1 licensing ratio, as long as a dedicated host is properly populated in full. Now, depending on the partner you choose for your OLA program, this is how the data will be presented to the customer. Now again, the data will be available on the actual portal from the partner, so the customer actually has full access to that data, which they can also share with AWS as they actually look into the inventory. Again, at the very least, they gain the valuable visualization of the current asset and footprint, infrastructure footprint, and also gives them a good rundown of their, for example, on-premises cost versus how that would be translated and migrated over to AWS, or even existing AWS assets that haven't been right-sized. This would give them a good indicator or projection as it is migrated over to a right-sized configuration. Now, these are some of the partners that the customer can actually work with within their OLA program. Now, it really depends on the customer on which partner they would want to work with. And in some cases, they actually have an existing relationship with one of these. So it really is also based on their comfort level. In some cases, they already have vetoed one of these to work with their particular IT infrastructure, so they can go with that. Either way, any one of these would definitely work when it comes to actually gathering utilization metrics for them to be able to get a good visualization and develop migration patterns and plans. Now, some of these again can be agent based, which can be really detailed in gathering utilization metrics up to getting the actual storage IO, which is especially useful when getting more detailed information and assessment for the database workloads. And some of these are actually non-invasive and doesn't really need to have an agent installed on any machine. So again, it really depends on what the customer wants and how their IT infrastructure configuration and security posture requires. Now, enterprises would rather focus on innovation for their customers rather than spend a significant time and effort in managing licenses. So let me introduce the AWS License Manager. Now, AWS License Manager is a one-stop solution for managing licenses from a variety of software vendors, such as Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, SAP, etc. With AWS License Manager, you can easily bring your existing licenses to AWS and remain compliant based on your license terms and benefit from the existing investments in enterprise agreements that you have with your vendors. AWS License Manager helps you manage licenses across your hybrid environments across AWS and even on-prem. With License Manager, you get the flexibility in bringing your customized terms in your enterprise agreements. And you can manage licenses based on your organizational processes and structure. With AWS License Manager, it has a built-in integration with various services within AWS, which gives you a seamless license management experience. So given ADFS's usage of Microsoft products, my License Manager is a great fit. It basically will be essentially their single pane of glass in tracking and managing their license usage. As I mentioned earlier, this allows automatic tracking of license usage, as well as prevent any runaway and untracked license usage. Now let me elaborate by talking about AWS's License Manager's benefits a bit more in detail. Now, looking at the benefits of AWS License Manager, the very first is its customizability. Now, as an administrator, you can create customized rules based on your enterprise agreements with your vendors. Now, these rules can be configured with how the licenses are measured, number one, how licenses are counted, and any licensing constraints that you have to essentially work with your vendors. Now, License Manager supports multiple vendors, not just one. So the management of licenses is basically done based on rules which you specify while getting started on this service. And this service is not tied to any particular software vendor or software product, which gives you that flexibility of managing a variety of licenses from different vendors such as Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, etc. And not only those enterprise software, you can even manage your marketplace products that has built-in licensing already as part of that product bundle. Now, if you are bringing your own license, in this case with ADFS, they are bringing their own Microsoft licenses. Or if you bring your own license with Marketplace, you can use it with AWS License Manager to manage the usage of those licenses. Once you have set up the rules, you can then enforce licensing. Once you have set up the rules, the users can continue business as usual, and you can be confident that the usage is actually based on the terms that you have specified in the service. Now, to get started with AWS License Manager, the first step is to actually define your licensing rules. Now, you would define these licensing rules based on the terms in your enterprise agreement with your different software vendors. Now, after which is actually enforcing those rules. AWS License Manager provides you multiple options through which you can enforce those rules, and you can choose based on your preference. And lastly, once you have enforced your licensing rules, the service keeps track of usage automatically. And you can keep track of how many licenses are used and where they are used using the built-in dashboard. Now, diving deeper into the rules, you can specify how the licenses are measured, whether they're measured by virtual CPUs, physical cores, or physical sockets. Now, we talked about the service being able to manage licenses from a variety of software vendors. So any licenses that's based on vCPU or sockets can be managed by the service. With AWS License Manager, you can also specify usage limits. You can specify the number of licenses that you are bringing, and you can define them as either a soft or a hard limit. So this service gives you the flexibility where you can have the control over multiple knobs and buttons of how you configure the rules. If, for example, you set these limits as soft limits, then you can still go over the actual limit that you specify and configured. But you then get notified through Amazon's simple notification service. Within the settings in AWS License Manager, you can actually specify your SNS topic, then get notified through email, text message, or any of the various mechanisms that notification service supports. Now, if you do specify those limits as actual hard limits, then AWS License Manager will strictly cap any new licenses being spun up as it hits the limit by actually preventing or stopping an instance from coming up. Now, typical scenarios for soft limits are when you have a true process and you're allowed to go over a certain amount of consumed licenses and then do a true up on the remaining licenses. For hard limits, it's pretty straightforward. You would do this for any software license where you need to have strict control over. Now, AWS License Manager also helps you bring any licensing constraints that you might have in your enterprise agreements with your vendor. Any licensing restrictions, such as a minimum or a maximum number of virtual CPUs per server, for example, physical cores or sockets, and if there are other restrictions, such as if certain licenses can only run a specific tenancy type, like a dedicated host. And also if you have restrictions based on mobility or software assurance. You can specify those while defining those rules. Now, once you have defined your licensing rules, the next step is to enforce those rules. Now, based on your organizational structure, you might be using different launch mechanisms, and this service provides you the flexibility to pick an option based on your preference. You can enforce licensing rules by first attaching them to your AMI or Amazon machine image. If you have a golden image or a standardized image, you can attach licensing rules to that image. And this is typical for software licenses that you bring over to AWS. And once you do that, any launches that happen from that image would automatically get tracked. If you use EC2 launch templates, you can specify a license configuration or a number of license configurations to use with your launch. If you use CloudFormation, you can also specify which license configuration or configurations to use. Now, there are enforcement capabilities through the API, so if you have an automated deployment mechanism, you can leverage the SDK tools and leverage License Manager API to enforce those rules through the API. Now, lastly, with AWS Service Catalog, you can import a CloudFormation template where you specify the license configuration or rules to use in your service catalog. And in the end, you can choose one or more of these enforcement capabilities together, and the usage would be managed seamlessly. Now, lastly, the license usage is tracked via a single easy-to-use dashboard. So if you are an administrator responsible for managing licenses, this is basically all you need to do to set up those rules and even enforce them. The tracking of license usage is done by the service itself, and you have this built-in dashboard available to you, which you can then leverage at the time of true-up or audit. So figuring out how many licenses they are using and which resources are being used is no longer a challenge with AWS License Manager's built-in dashboard. All right, now let's take a look at AWS License Manager a bit more in detail by doing a quick demonstration. All right, now I'm currently logged in the EC2 console, and this would show you a simulation of what currently Acme Data Financial Services is running as far as their EC2 instances are concerned. So currently they have 5 servers running. They have a jump server that allows users to be able to connect to internal resources, which are their 2 application servers across availability zones, and their 2 SQL servers, also only internally available. Now these instances are all from golden images that they are managing. So these are those images. One is a Windows 2019 golden image, which basically contains just a bare metal Windows Server 2019 image, EC2 image. And the second golden image contains Windows Plus SQL Server 2017 Enterprise Edition. Okay, so based off of these 2 AMIs, this will be what we'll be using to enforce the licenses. Okay. Now to get started, let's go ahead and go to AWS License Manager. All right. So right now, if we look at the dashboard, there's really nothing here currently because we haven't set any rules yet. We haven't enforced any licenses yet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be now going to the Customer Managed Licenses. So with the Acme Data Financial Services scenario, they will be bringing in their Microsoft licenses. So we'll be using these to create, and we'll be enforcing those rules. So let's go ahead and create our first enforcement rule. And let's name it our Windows Server 2019 Data Center Edition. Let's see. And we'll basically name the description. We'll copy the configuration name over to the description. And as far as our license type, let's go ahead and do it on a per vCPU basis. Okay. So now currently we have 5 servers running with 4 cores, 4 vCPUs each. So let's go ahead and set 20 vCPUs as far as our limit. Now this checkbox here essentially denotes whether it's going to be a hard limit or a soft limit. So for the purposes of this demo, let's go ahead and check this box. So we'll do a hard limit. Okay, for the product information, let's do Windows Server Data Center, and let's do 2019. And only the resource type is only EC2 for this particular product information. All right, let's go ahead and click Submit. Okay, now we have created our first managed license rule. And so the next thing we want to do is basically associate an AMI, right? So we can do that by clicking on the configuration name, like so. And then we can go over to the associated AMIs over here, and then we can associate a specific AMI. So in this case, we're going to be actually selecting both Windows 2019 with SQL 2017 and the 2019 golden image, just for the purposes of this demo. Because, of course, SQL Server predominantly runs on Windows 2019 and their golden image is sitting on Windows Server 2019. So any instances of SQL Server using this image also consumes a Windows Server license. Okay. All right, so let's associate that. And for this demo, we're just going to use this one account. Hit confirm. All right. So the next thing we want to do is actually go over to the search inventory. Okay, so these instances are actually reflected from SSM. So let's actually go to SSM, and let me show you guys how these are actually scraped. So if you go to Systems Manager, and if you go to Inventory, you'd be able to see all the managed instances that's essentially managed by a Systems Manager. So as you can see, all of these are all the EC2 running instances that I showed earlier. Now, just take note, for you to be able to do this seamlessly, you need to have Systems Manager manage your private AMIs as they're spun up. So most customers, what they do is they do a sysprep and make sure that they have an SSM agent installed, and then save that particular AMI, which is ready for future deployments. So that was the case here. So all of these instances are deployed with those configured golden images that's managed by SSM. Okay. So from here, the basic level, once it's managed, you'll be able to see all of that in the inventory here in License Manager. There's a lot more you can do here in Systems Manager, such as actually scrape all the running software, basically do patch baselines. And all of those will actually be covered by an SSM specific session after my part 1, which is license and optimization. Okay. All right. Now going back to License Manager, what we want to do is we want to be able to associate all the running instances, as all of these are actually running Windows 2019. So what we're going to do is we want to associate a license configuration, right? And let's do Windows 2019 Data Center, which is the one we just created. All right. And let's make sure that this is unchecked, or else you would actually run into an error because this is not unique. So let's associate that. All right. Now, as you can see, what happens now is if you go back to the dashboard, you'd be able to see what you actually have configured as far as your limits are concerned. You have 20 vCPU as far as your Windows Server 2019 core limit, and you're already consuming 20 because it actually counted the actual number of vCPUs per instance that you associated. Okay. All right, so we did that for Windows Server 2019. Let's do another rule for SQL Server. Okay. All right, let's do the exact same thing, but in this case, we'll do SQL 2017 Enterprise Edition. Let's go ahead and copy that over to the description here. And for the license types, we're also going to be doing virtual CPUs. So in this case, we only have 8 currently running. So let's do an 8 hard limit, and let's go ahead and do a let's go ahead and enforce that. Now let me go ahead and fill this with the appropriate information, which is SQL Server 2017 on EC2, and let's click on Submit. Okay, now that has been created. Now again, the next thing I would want to do is associate an actual AMI for proper tracking. So let me do that. So let me just choose one, because we just want to be specific to what this is tracking, which is the SQL Server. Just remember that the AMIs can actually overlap as far as their associations are concerned. Remember that earlier with the 2019 rule, we associated both of these, but for SQL 2017, we're going to be just associating just the SQL Server here. So let's associate that. Again, only for this account. All right. Okay. So now what we can do is we can go back to the inventory, but since I don't have the actual name, let me get the actual information here as far as their instance ID, which is 87 and 3D. So let me go back here, and I'm going to go ahead and select these 2 instances that are running SQL 2017 Enterprise Edition, and I'm going to go ahead and associate that. So now, as you can see, since I have already created the rule for SQL Server,
Let me go ahead and choose that and associate. All right, so what happens now is if you go to dashboard, you will actually see both rules here in effect, right? So you'd see how many vCPUs you're allocated per rule and how much of it is consuming. And as you can see, I actually set it to what's currently running. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate how that hard limit is demonstrated or enforced, I'm sorry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to EC2 console and I'm going to go ahead and go on to the AMI, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch this particular image based off of the Windows 2019, right? So let's launch that. And let's do a 4-core CPU based off of the T3. It's large. Okay. Just gonna go ahead and click on review and launch. And so let's launch that. All right, now you see the rule enforcing the license limit. As you can see, you can't spin up any new EC2 instances based off of that AMI because that AMI is what's associated with our licensing rule. We set a hard limit of 20, and now since you're already consuming 20 and you're trying to spin up new instances with that license, it's not allowing you to. So this is essentially the hard limit working in effect. So let's do the same thing for the other AMI, which is SQL Server. Okay, so let's launch that. I'm just going to choose a specific instance type, which has 4 cores, similar to earlier. I'm just going to go ahead and skip to launch, just to show how the hard limit is enforced on that secondary rule. So I'm going to launch that AMI, and there you go. Launch failed because you've hit the threshold for your allocated licenses for SQL Server. Okay, so again, with AWS License Manager, you can easily build guardrails around your licenses, and you can also do a quick look and you have a single pane of glass to basically manage all your licenses. Now again, this is just a basic demonstration that shows both Windows Server 2019 and SQL Server 2017 Enterprise Edition. You can mix and match not just Microsoft, even other vendor licenses as well. Alright, now let's go back and take a look at Acme Financial Data Services' architecture again. Now that we actually introduced the OLA program to help optimize and right-size their assets and license usage, as well as AWS License Manager to help track their licenses, as well as prevent any runaway licenses from being used. Now, we were able to actually create a cost-effective scenario where AFDS can actually use a dedicated host to host their Microsoft licenses, which allowed them to license those licenses or assets on a physical core level, hence giving them a 2-to-1 licensing ratio. In summary, on this part 1 of this series where we're talking about license optimization, we looked at 2 useful tools and program, which is namely OLA, the Optimization and Licensing Assessment Program, as well as AWS License Manager, to essentially help customers, in this case Acme Financial Data Services, properly right-size both assets and licenses as they are moved over here in AWS. This can also work with assets already running in AWS that haven't had their actual utilization assessed. Now with AWS License Manager, we showed how you can efficiently track those licenses and set guardrails to essentially prevent runaway licenses from being spun up. Okay, and that's it for our first section for this 6-part video series. The next session is around managing Windows on AWS, so stay tuned for that. Once again, my name is Julius Sacramento, and thank you for joining me in this session, and have a wonderful day.